pain and for enhancing appetite. So we have had these drugs around for since 1985. They're both oral medications, and as I said, both made in pharmaceutical companies who've gone through the FDA. I just think this is a fun fact. One joint contains the amount of anandamide that's found in 60 pounds of chocolate. So, take your pick. I take the chocolate, actually. As long as it's good chocolate. Most people mean by medical marijuana the phytocannabinoid or botanical cannabis that's shown here. And I was struck by how, at least in the bill that I read for the first time last night from Minnesota, the only part that seems to matter for weight is the flowers. Is that how folks read it that way? The rest of it, the roots, the stems, the leaves, all the rest are not counted in the weight of what a person would be allowed to have, which is 2.5 grams. Recreational medical use do blend. There are desirable traits of smoked cannabis. The smoked issue is obviously a major issue to talk about, but the point about smoking, the point about smoked things, about tobacco, about cocaine, about methamphetamine, etc., is it has a very high bioavailability and it's available right away in a rapid, predictable way. So there's an easy titration for the person using that substance to the point that they want to get, whether it be pain relief or whether it be to be blitzed. But the point is they control it, and the burning gets it via the lungs and the bloodstream to the brain almost immediately. And there is, in fact, more control with smoke than a pill. And Marinol, for example, has not really been very effective, partly because of first-pass metabolism, partly because of irregular absorption. So the comparison, I think, is a bit specious. Some have written that Marinol is actually a better drug for people with chronic pain who can take it over time to deal with that chronic pain, not with acute pain. So it's not a great drug. It is the one that we have, but the notion that somehow it's the only one, or would be the only one, is kind of crazy too, since our whole pharmaceutical industry is about developing new forms, new methods, everything from patches and pills to vaporizing. Now there is an entourage effect which is also spoken of and not terribly well understood, but it does seem that the cannabidiol, which has no psychoactive effects, interacts with the tetrahydrocannabinol, which has the psychoactive effects, to modulate. So that if you have cannabidiol along with the THC, you're less likely to have bad psychoactive effects. Or if you were a drug dealer, you would argue that you want to get rid of the CBD so you can have a really mind-blowing psychoactive effect. Paranoia rises as the ratio of cannabidiol to THC drops. Okay? So some of the breeding that's been going on in the drug community is to try to get rid of the CBD and try to increase the THC to proportions that were unknown 20 or 30 years ago. But as I like to say, that there are plenty of Luther Burbanks out there who are doing what they can to create new kinds of weed. Marijuana, why shouldn't glaucoma patients have all the fun? I like this cartoon because it does speak again to this blurred boundary. Because we do know that cannabis can be helpful for glaucoma patients, but obviously glaucoma patients who are using it for the glaucoma might also enjoy getting high at the same time. That's part of the dilemma. Goals of ingestion diverge. Recreational users seek euphoria. That's the whole point. The medical users are seeking symptom relief. And medical users tend to use less. And naive users don't like the drug. I wrote a piece for the New England Journal about a 67-year-old woman, I think she was. I wrote the pro. They invited me to write a piece. I said, I'll write the pro, I'll write the con, I don't care. I can write either one. Either way, I'll write in the middle, which is what I believe. They told me to do the pro, so I did it. But the point was, this woman had never had any exposure to marijuana. She now had metastatic breast cancer with bone involvement. And one of the issues was that she might not like the medical marijuana smoking because she wouldn't like getting high because she'd never been high before. Okay? So that's kind of the tension here. You might be getting your pain relief while you're getting high for the first time, which is a pretty strange combination. People who have recreational experience who then later are using it for medicinal purposes don't mind the high because they're familiar with it, they know it. At least that's what's been said and written. And the medical and recreational use do overlap, because medical users do in fact have high rates of former recreational use. Euphoria may in fact enhance symptom relief. That's not terribly well understood, but there's something about dissociating from the pain that may be a function of the high. So that also is in there as well. What exactly is pain, and what are the elements of pain that this drug might contribute to? What makes a lot of physicians very anxious is the notion that the prescription would say, if we were allowed to write prescriptions, which we are not, smoke as much as you need. And by the way, on that point, we cannot prescribe in any state right now legally because of the federal injunction, but there was a court case in 2000 was the opinion, that even doctors, believe it or not, had Second Amendment rights to free speech. So you could recommend. It's kind of a dodge, but I think it's an interesting dodge. Dangers of medical marijuana. In the production in the local garden, or not, the usual pharmacotherapy evaluation standards have been sidestepped. That is, the FDA has not been involved. Smoked cannabis has been called by none other than Robert DuPont, who was the first head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse under Nixon, called it a complex chemical slush, which is true. This plant has hundreds of substances in it. And even worse, if you smoke them, you pyrolyze them, burning them, making many, many more substances. So it's much more than just THC, although THC is the thing that gets talked about. Cannabis and tobacco smoke contain similar toxins, allegedly yielding long-term risks that are similar. I'm not convinced about that, but you can find whatever you want to support whatever you want to say about that one way or the other. States have legalized medical marijuana in the absence of supporting science. Certainly that is true. But I am also trying to contend for you that the federal government illegalized medical marijuana without any supporting science either. So neither way do we have science. In both cases, in 1970 we have politics, and now in 2014 we have politics as well. The only issue that I'll get to at the very end is that we don't have any way of studying this right now, which makes it hard to get science, which is why we're at a standstill in my opinion. Psychosis and marijuana. I'm a psychiatrist and I'm concerned about psychosis. And cannabis, there are 4 hypotheses that are all out there. Cannabis use may cause schizophrenia. That's a popular one. That quote is made often. It may precipitate psychosis in the vulnerable. It may exacerbate psychotic symptoms. And it may be more likely to cause trouble in schizophrenics. Now, I'll give you a hint. From my reading the literature, 3 of the 4 things are true. One of them is not. So we'll talk about that. Cannabis causes schizophrenia. Now, Australia has had an astronomical rise in the use of cannabis, rather parallel in the US. And in that nation, cannabis use is dramatically up, but the incidence of schizophrenia is unchanged. So that's pretty good evidence from an epidemiologic perspective that marijuana is not causing schizophrenia any more than schizophrenia would have been there anyway. In the background population. So hypothesis number 1 is unsupported. Cannabis precipitates psychosis in the vulnerable. There is a fair amount of evidence to support that, in fact, this is the case, but in those who are already vulnerable. So what may happen if you're a heavy cannabis user is that you may end up becoming psychotic sooner than you otherwise would have and more intensely.
Is there any age correlation to that, however? In other words, a 16-year-old versus a 40-year-old?
Well, what I would toss back is, when does schizophrenia come out?
In the young.
In the young. So, and also, it's actually a great question with a lot of different potential answers, because most people stop using at 25 anyway. Cannabis is really a drug of the young. I'm going to make another point, that cannabis is really problematic in people with developing brains. So you have a developing brain if you have an 18-year-old, you have potential for schizophrenia coming out for the first time if you're an 18-year-old, and you're using weed like everybody else because you're 18 years old, which makes your schizophrenia potentially come out more intensely and earlier. It's not an easy answer, and that's been part of the challenge. But probably for a 40-year-old using for the first time, I don't think there's any evidence to support that suddenly it would bring out your schizophrenia. By then you would probably have it in most cases. So I think the second hypothesis is in fact supported, that if you have a tendency towards schizophrenia and you are using this drug, you will probably have a more difficult course in terms of the intensity of your symptoms and their resistance to treatment. Cannabis use exacerbates psychosis. There have been various studies that have looked at people using the medication. They're more likely to be hospitalized, or the drug, more likely to be hospitalized, and the more heavy the use, the more, again, more likely that is to be. Again, probably because the psychosis is more intense. And again, I think there are tricky situations where people become psychotic and they're not necessarily diagnosed with schizophrenia then, but they have a predisposition towards psychosis. And again, there's a study here that speaks about that. A very crude definition of what constitutes heavy and not heavy use. More than one marijuana cigarette a day was heavy, less than one cigarette a day was light. That seems to be, that's the level of science we've got, not very elegant at all. And finally, clearly there is a synergy between the gene and the environment. The environment in this case being the use of cannabis. So we know that schizophrenic, there are genes that suggest a pre-existing vulnerability. There appears to be a vulnerability that's particularly pronounced in the young for the reasons that I just commented on. And cannabis does dysregulate the endocannabinoid system. I haven't said anything about the endocannabinoid system yet, but I will get there in a moment. But the point is, the endocannabinoid system in any case is related to every other system in the body involving neurotransmitters. So if you mess with one, you'll mess with all the others. We know this is not anything unfamiliar to us. The only thing that is kind of crazy is that we somehow see cannabis and marijuana and endocannabinoids out there and unrelated to the rest of the body. So the synergistic effect is that psychosis occurs earlier and the ongoing use makes the illness course more difficult. So if you were trying to treat someone who had a psychosis going on, you would try to get them to stop using cannabis so that the treatments you were using would hopefully be more effective. Cannabis use before age 16, a real problem. But again, is it association or causation? I think most of what we know is that it's association. That if you're using before you're 16, you're more likely to be using other drugs. You're more likely to be a delinquent. You're more likely to have trouble at school. You're more likely to get injured. You're more likely to have physical complaints. But again, all these things could very well be happening in the context of psychosocial disaster. Hospitalization and illness rates, if you start using before age 12, you have 5 times the risk of being hospitalized. But I think you would argue that most anybody who's 11 and using recreational drugs is in real trouble. And the reason they're hospitalized, at least when I've been on the child psych unit at our place, may have been because of their crazy parents rather than them. That is, they're in an environment in which they can do all this stuff because their parents are out to lunch. That's a technical term, out to lunch. Moderate use after age 18, there has not been observed any increase in the mental illness rate. It's before 18 that we worry about quite a lot. And I want to say again that association is not causality. And we hear a lot in the language that's going on both sides of the implication that that one causes the other. But I think that is not true. We don't know that yet. Heavy users, 3% eventually develop schizophrenia, and there is some suggestion we could delay or prevent about 1 in 6 new onset psychoses. But at least from my experience as a psychiatrist with schizophrenia, the prodromal issues involved with schizophrenia are profound. Long before there's psychosis, withdrawal, there's school failure, there's tendency to turn to substances, etc. And we don't really understand that very well either, but it plays into whatever conversation we have about that. This is just a little picture. I think this is in Switzerland, a cute little entryway that some gardener carved to make an appropriate approach to a marijuana garden. Would you like one of those in Minnesota? You don't have to grow marijuana, you can grow roses, sort of. Okay. So cannabis is a gateway. Certainly, regular heavy adolescent use is associated with use of other drugs. And often it's just one more drug that people are experimenting with to see what it will do to their head. But the notion that somehow marijuana leads to the others, I think, is unproven at this point. Cannabis use could be a marker for deviant behavior, although it could easily be a marker for being adolescent as well. in many of our suburbs and cities. Other illicits maybe are simply around. And like I said, there was sort of one amusing study that showed that if you used cannabis more than once a week, you were more likely to take up cigarettes, tobacco, which is kind of interesting. Marijuana dependence does occur. Any notion that it does not occur, which was one of the questions that interested me when I was dealing with my son. He said, oh, it's not a problem. Nobody ever gets it, blah, blah, yeah. Well, adolescent rite of passage for most. Use tends to peak in the late teens and early 20s, the college years. But most people stop using when they start getting adult responsibilities. And if you start using after age 25, there's almost no known addiction as defined starting then, unlike every other drug. So there's something different about the way that this drug works from an addiction point of view. Also, the 10% figure is much lower than cigarettes, heroin, cocaine, or alcohol, which have much higher rates of potential addiction or dependence. As I mentioned, use plummets with careers and families. People don't want to be stupid anymore. They want to be paying attention. They turn to other drugs, probably cigarettes, maybe, I don't know what, or maybe nothing at all. And then lifetime marijuana dependence risk, the best we know, is 9%.
9% of what, people who ever have tried it?
Who are ever using it, probably on a regular basis. I mean, again, against heroin, cocaine, alcohol, people who use it regularly, end up not giving it up in 9% of cases. That would be the way I'd understand that, which again is lower than things like heroin, cocaine, etc. The endocannabinoid system. Now, I've already alluded to this several different times, but my understanding is that it's really analogous to the opiate system. It's widespread throughout the body. The endocannabinoid system was really unknown prior to the late 20th century. This is developments in the 1980s and 1990s. Again, Israel gave us the THC structure. It was elucidated by Raphael Mekulam in 1964. He's still active at 91 or 2 or 3 as a researcher on marijuana. The CB1 receptor, which is the psychoactive receptor, was not cloned until 1990. The anandamide, the endogenous cannabinoid, was not discovered until 1992. And since 1992, the CB2 receptor has been cloned, which is on the cannabidiol probably, CB2 is widespread throughout the body, CB1 is primarily in the